The morning sun had barely risen over London when Camilla Parker Bowles made her way through the quiet corridors of Clarence House. Her hands trembled slightly as she zipped up the last of her designer suitcases. Inside were carefully folded clothes, jewelry boxes, and personal documents she had been gathering for weeks. She glanced at her watch nervously. The private car would arrive in 30 minutes to take her to a small airfield outside the city. Far from the prying eyes of the media and the royal family, everything had been planned in secret. After months of growing tension within the palace walls, mounting pressure from certain members of the royal household, and increasingly hostile treatment from the public, Camilla had reached her breaking point. The whispers in the hallways had grown louder. The cold shoulders from staff members had become unbearable. Even some members of the extended royal family had stopped acknowledging her presence at formal events. She felt trapped in a gilded cage, and the only solution she could see was to leave Britain entirely and start fresh somewhere. Far away, she had contacted an old friend who lived in France, someone from her past who had always offered her refuge if she ever needed it. The plan was simple: drive to the private airfield, board a small chartered plane, disappear across the channel before anyone realized she was gone. No official announcements, no formal farewells, just a quiet exit from a life that had become increasingly unbearable. She would send a letter to Charles later explaining her decision. By then, she would already be safe in another country. Beyond the reach of the palace's influence, Camilla took one last look around her private chambers. The elegant furniture, the expensive paintings on the walls, the luxurious carpets beneath her feet, all of it represented a life she had fought so hard to be part of. But now, that same life felt like a prison. The price of being part of the royal family had become too high. The constant scrutiny, the never-ending criticism, the feeling that she would never be accepted no matter what she did, it had all become too much to bear. She heard footsteps in the corridor outside and froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. Had someone discovered her plan? She held her breath, listening carefully. The footsteps passed by her door and faded into the distance. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm her racing pulse. She needed to stay focused. In just a few more minutes, the car would arrive, and she would be on her way to freedom. Camilla grabbed her handbag and did a final check of its contents. Passport, cash in multiple currencies, credit cards under a name the palace didn't monitor closely, and the phone number of her contact in France. Everything was ready. She pulled on her coat, a simple, dark design that would help her blend in rather than stand out. She had specifically chosen not to wear anything that would immediately identify her as a member of the royal family. No expensive brooches, no recognizable designer labels, nothing that would draw attention. The plan was to slip out through a side entrance of Clarence House that was rarely used. Her driver, someone she had hired privately and paid generously for his discretion, would be waiting in an unmarked vehicle. From there, it would be a 2-hour drive to the airfield where the chartered plane was already fueled and ready for immediate departure. She had paid extra to ensure there would be no flight plan filed until after they were already in the air, making it harder for anyone to track her movements as she made her way down the servants' staircase, carrying her to heaviest bags while leaving the others to be collected by her driver. Camilla's mind raced through all the things that could go wrong. What if someone from the palace staff noticed her leaving? What if Charles tried to call her and became suspicious when she didn't answer? What if the media had somehow gotten wind of her plans? She pushed these thoughts aside. It was too late to turn back now. She had made her decision. She was committed to seeing it through. The side entrance came into view at the end of a narrow corridor. Through the small window in the door, she could see the dark sedan waiting exactly where it was supposed to be. Relief washed over her. The driver stepped out and opened the trunk, ready to load her luggage. This was really happening. In just a few moments, she would be in that car, and her escape would be underway. Camilla pushed open the door and stepped outside into the cool morning air. The driver quickly took her bags and placed them in the trunk while she climbed into the back seat. She kept her head down, not wanting to look at the building she was leaving behind. The driver got in, started the engine. They began to pull away from Clarence House. Camilla allowed herself a small smile. She had done it. She was actually leaving. But as the car turned onto the main road, something caught her attention. Another vehicle, a large black SUV, suddenly pulled in behind them. At first she thought it might just be a coincidence. But when their car turned right at the next intersection, the SUV followed. Her stomach tightened with anxiety. When they turned left a few blocks later, and the SUV was still behind them, she knew something was wrong. She leaned forward and spoke quietly to the driver, asking if he had noticed the vehicle following them. The driver glanced in his rearview mirror and nodded grimly. He suggested trying to lose them, but before he could accelerate, 2 more black vehicles appeared, one in front of them and one pulling up alongside. The car was boxed in completely. Camilla's heart sank. Somehow, someone had discovered her plan. The vehicles forced her car to pull over to the side of the road in a quiet residential area where there were few witnesses. The doors of the surrounding vehicles opened. Several men in dark suits stepped out. They weren't police officers, and they weren't regular security personnel. Camilla recognized them immediately as members of the Royal Guard, the elite security force that protected the highest-ranking members of the royal family. But these weren't just any guards. She recognized the lead officer, Commander James Blackwell, a stern-faced man in his 50s who reported directly to the highest levels of royal security. His presence meant this was serious. Commander Blackwell approached her vehicle and knocked firmly on the window. Camilla's driver looked at her uncertainly, waiting for instructions. She nodded slowly, knowing she had no choice but to comply. The driver unlocked the doors. Blackwell opened her door and stood at attention, his expression completely neutral. He spoke in a calm but firm voice, informing her that he had been ordered to prevent her departure from the country. Camilla felt a mix of anger and humiliation wash over her. She demanded to know by whose authority he was detaining her, though she already knew the answer. Blackwell simply replied that he was acting on direct orders from the palace, that she needed to return to Clarence's house immediately. When she refused, insisting that she had every right to travel where she pleased, Blackwell's expression didn't change. He informed her that this was not a request, but a directive from the highest level of the royal household. If she refused to cooperate voluntarily, he had the authority to take her into protective custody. The word protective was emphasized in a way that made it clear this was not a suggestion she could ignore. Camilla realized with growing horror that she had underestimated the palace's ability to monitor her movements and their willingness to intervene so dramatically. She asked how they had known. About her plans? Blackwell didn't answer directly, mentioned that certain financial transactions had raised red flags. The hiring of a private charter plane had not gone unnoticed. Someone within her circle had clearly been reporting to the palace, though Blackwell wouldn't reveal who. Camilla felt betrayed and trapped. She had thought she was being so careful, covering her tracks, using cash when possible, keeping her plans secret, even from most of her closest confidants. But somehow the palace had known everything. Commander Blackwell then made a statement that sent chills down her spine. He needed to inspect her luggage before she could go anywhere. Camilla protested immediately, arguing that her personal belongings were private and he had no right to search them without proper legal authority. But Blackwell calmly explained that under the royal household's security protocols, particularly when there were concerns about potential security breaches or the removal of sensitive materials, he had full authority to inspect any luggage belonging to members of the royal family. The guards began removing her suitcases from the trunk of her vehicle. Camilla watched helplessly as they placed each piece of luggage on the ground and prepared to open them right there on the street. She demanded they at least do this somewhere more private. But Blackwell said time was of the essence and this needed to happen immediately. The humiliation of having her personal belongings searched on a public street, even though there were few people around at this early hour, was almost unbearable as the guards opened the first suitcase. Carefully examining each item, Camilla's mind raced. What were they looking for? Did they think she was stealing royal jewels, taking classified documents, or was this simply a power play, a way to remind her that she was not as free as she thought she was? She watched as they methodically went through her clothes, her shoes, her personal items, treating each one with professional detachment. It was invasive and degrading, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. When they reached the second suitcase, one of the guards pulled out a small locked box. Blackwell asked her to open it. Camilla hesitated. Inside that box were her most private possessions, old letters, photographs, and personal mementos from her life before she joined the royal family. Things she never wanted anyone else to see. She refused to open it, insisting it contained nothing of interest to them. But Blackwell's expression remained unchanged. He could have it forced open, or she could open it voluntarily. Either way, he would see what was inside. Camilla's hand shook as she reluctantly reached for the small key on her necklace chain. The locked box contained more than just old memories. Inside were letters she had exchanged with Charles during their affair, long before his divorce from Diana was finalized. There were also photographs from that period, and most damaging of all, there was a diary she had kept during those tumultuous years. She had always meant to destroy these items, but sentiment had kept her from doing so. Now that weakness was about to expose her to scrutiny she couldn't afford, she unlocked the box slowly, her fingers fumbling with the tiny key. Commander Blackwell reached for it immediately, but she pulled it back instinctively. She looked at him with desperation in her eyes and asked if they could please do this in private, away from the other guards. For the first time, Blackwell's stern expression softened slightly. He nodded and dismissed the other guards to give them some privacy, though they remained close enough to intervene if needed. Blackwell examined the contents of the box carefully. He flipped through the letters without reading them in detail, looked at the photographs briefly, and then picked up the diary. Camilla watched him with growing anxiety. What would he do with this information? Would it be reported back to Charles? Would it somehow find its way to the media? The possibilities for disaster seemed endless. These items, if made public, could reignite old controversies and damage not just her reputation but Charles's as well. After what felt like an eternity, Blackwell closed the box and looked at her directly. He spoke in a lower voice now, one that carried a hint of understanding beneath the professional demeanor. He told her that he understood why she wanted to leave, that he had seen the pressure she had been under, and that his job wasn't to judge her but to protect the royal family's interests. However, these items in the box represented a security risk. If she had successfully left the country and something happened to her, or her luggage was lost or stolen, the contents could fall into the wrong hands. Camilla felt a mix of relief and continued fear. She asked what would happen to the box. Blackwell explained that it would need to be returned to Clarence House, under secure escort and placed in a royal vault where such sensitive materials were kept. She would still have access to it, but it would be protected and monitored. The implication was clear: she would never again be able to take these items and disappear with them. They would remain under the palace's control. She nodded in resignation, understanding that she had no choice. Blackwell signaled to his team, who began repacking her luggage. Everything was being loaded not into her hired car, but into one of the Royal Guard vehicles. Her driver sat in his own car, clearly uncertain about what to do. Blackwell walked over to him and spoke quietly. Whatever was said made the driver nod quickly and drive away without looking back. Camilla never saw him again, and later learned he had been paid handsomely for his silence about the morning's events. Camilla was directed into one of the black SUVs, sitting in the back seat between two guards. It felt less like protection and more like custody. Commander Blackwell sat in the front passenger seat and gave instructions to the driver to return to Clarence House. The convoy of vehicles made their way through the London streets as the city was beginning to wake up. Morning commuters passed by, completely unaware that inside one of these dark vehicles sat a member of the royal family whose escape attempt had just been foiled. During the drive back, Camilla's mind raced through everything that had gone wrong. Someone had betrayed her, that much was certain. But who? She had been so careful about who she told and what she revealed. She had used cash for most transactions, hired people outside her usual circle, and made plans that she thought were untraceable. Yet the Royal Guard had known exactly where she would be and when. They had known about the charter plane, about her destination, about everything. The betrayal cut deep, but the sense of helplessness cut even deeper. When they arrived at Clarence House, she was escorted not through the side entrance she had left from, but through the main entrance. ensuring that staff members would see her return. It was a calculated move designed to squash any rumors before they could start. If servants began gossiping about her sudden absence, seeing her return under guard would send a clear message she had tried to leave and had been stopped. The palace controlled the narrative as it always did. She was taken to a private drawing room where she was asked to wait. The guards remained outside the door, making it clear she was not free to leave. She sat on the elegant sofa, feeling numb. All her planning, all her hope for escape had come to nothing. She was still trapped, and now the palace knew she had been desperate enough to try to flee. That knowledge would give them even more power over her. After nearly an hour, the door opened, and to her shock, Charles himself entered the room. She had expected to be confronted by palace officials, perhaps the Queen's private secretary or other senior household members, but Charles had come in person, and his expression was unlike any she had seen before. It wasn't anger exactly, but disappointment mixed with something else, concern perhaps. Or maybe calculation. He sat down across from her and remained silent for a long moment. Then he asked her a simple question: why? Why had she tried to leave in such a dramatic and secretive manner? Why hadn't she come to him if things were truly unbearable? Camilla felt a surge of emotions, anger, frustration, sadness, all threatening to pour out at once. She had tried to talk to him before, many times, about how difficult things had become. But he had been focused on his own duties and responsibilities, always assuring her that time would make things better, that public opinion would eventually shift, that she just needed to be patient. She told him that patience had run out, that every day felt like a battle, every public appearance felt like running a gauntlet of judgment and hostility. She told him about the staff members who barely concealed their contempt, about the family members who excluded her from informal gatherings, about the press that twisted every word and gesture into something sinister. She told him that she had reached a point where leaving seemed like the only way to preserve what was left of her sanity and dignity. Charles listened, without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled as she spoke. When she finished, he was quiet for another long moment. Then he told her something that surprised her. The Queen had been informed of her attempted departure before it even happened. In fact, the Queen had been the one who ordered the royal guard to intercept her. It hadn't been Charles's decision at all. He had only learned about it after the fact, when he was awakened by a call from Commander Blackwell informing him that the situation had been contained. Camilla felt a chill run through her. The Queen, always so distant and formal with her, had been monitoring her closely enough to know about her escape plans before they were executed. That level of surveillance was frightening. It meant that nothing she did, no plan she made, no conversation she had, was truly private. The palace had eyes and ears everywhere, and she had been naive to think otherwise. Charles explained that from the Queen's perspective, a senior member of the royal family leaving the country in secret would create a scandal that could damage the monarchy's reputation at a time when it was already facing criticism. The optics of such a departure, especially if it became public that she had been stopped by royal guards, could be disastrous. Therefore, the Queen had made the decision to prevent it from happening at all. It wasn't personal, he insisted. It was about protecting the institution. But to Camilla, it felt deeply personal. She had been treated like a prisoner, her belongings searched, her privacy violated, her freedom curtailed, all in the name of protecting an institution that had never fully accepted her in the first place. She asked Charles what would happen now. Would she be watched constantly? Would she ever be allowed to travel? Would she spend the rest of her life as a captive in a gilded cage? Charles assured her that wasn't the intention. But he also couldn't make promises about what restrictions might be placed on her movements going forward. The trust had been broken, and it would take time to rebuild. In the meantime, there would need to be discussions about her role, her security arrangements, and her future within the royal family. These conversations would involve not just him but senior advisors and possibly the Queen herself. Camilla realized that her failed escape attempt had made everything worse rather than better. She had thought she was taking control of her life, but instead, she had given the palace even more control over her. The irony was bitter. She asked if she could at least return to her private chambers and rest. Charles nodded and stood to leave, but before he reached the door, he turned back and said something that stayed with her. He told her that despite everything, he wanted her to stay, that he needed her to stay, and that they would find a way to make things better. But his words felt hollow in that moment, overshadowed by the reality of what had just happened. When she finally returned to her chambers, accompanied by a guard who positioned himself outside her door, Camilla collapsed onto her bed in exhaustion. Her carefully packed suitcases had been returned to her room but remained packed, a reminder of her failed attempt at freedom. She stared at the ceiling, wondering what would come next, and whether life within the royal family would ever be bearable again. The events of the morning had changed everything, and there was no going back to the way things were before. She was now a member of the royal family who had tried to escape and failed. That failure would define how she was seen and treated for a very long time to come. The days following her intercepted escape attempt were some of the longest and most isolating of Camilla's life. She was not officially under house arrest, but the increased security presence around her quarters made it feel very similar. Guards were stationed at every exit point. She noticed unfamiliar faces among the household staff people, who watched her more carefully than regular servants would. The palace had tightened its grip. She felt it in every moment of every day. Charles had returned to his official duties, leaving her to deal with the aftermath largely on her own. He visited her chambers occasionally, usually late in the evening after his engagements were finished. Their conversations were strained and awkward. He tried to be supportive, but there was an underlying tension neither of them could ignore. He knew she had been willing to leave him and everything they had built together. That knowledge created a barrier between them that kind words and gentle gestures couldn't easily breach. On the third day after the incident, Camilla received a formal summons to meet with Sir Malcolm Hartley, the Queen's private secretary and one of the most powerful figures in the royal household. She had dealt with him before on various matters, but never in a context like this. The meeting was scheduled for late afternoon in one of the palace's formal sitting rooms, a choice of location that itself conveyed the seriousness of the situation. This was not a casual conversation, but an official proceeding. She dressed carefully for the meeting, choosing a conservative outfit that projected dignity and composure, even though she felt neither. 2 guards escorted her through the palace corridors to the designated room. Sir Malcolm was already there, seated behind an ornate desk that had been brought in specifically for this meeting. The formal setup felt more like an interrogation than a discussion. He gestured for her to sit in the chair across from him. The guards took up positions by the door. Sir Malcolm began without pleasantries. He laid out the palace's position in clear, bureaucratic language. Her attempt to leave the country had created what he called a security incident of the highest concern. The royal family's movements were not just personal matters, but affairs of state, and any unauthorized departure could have diplomatic security and public relations implications. He emphasized that she had put not just herself, but the entire institution at risk with her actions. Camilla listened in silence, feeling like a child being scolded by a stern headmaster. Sir Malcolm continued, explaining that an internal investigation had been launched to determine how she had managed to arrange her escape attempt without it being detected earlier. Several staff members had already been questioned, and those found to have assisted her would face consequences. The chartered plane she had hired had been grounded, and its operators were being investigated for failing to report the booking through proper channels. She felt a pang of guilt thinking about the innocent people who might lose their jobs or face legal trouble because they had helped her. The pilot of the charter plane was simply trying to make a living. Her driver had needed the money she paid him. None of them had done anything wrong except assist someone they believed had every right to travel. But in the palace's view, anyone who aided her escape was complicit in a security breach, and they would be treated accordingly. Sir Malcolm then moved to the matter of her confiscated belongings, specifically the locked box containing her personal letters and diary. He informed her that these items had been reviewed by senior palaces officials to assess whether they contained any information that could pose a threat to the royal family if made public. Camilla felt her face flush with anger and embarrassment. The thought of strangers reading her most private thoughts and intimate correspondence was mortifying. She demanded to know who had read them and what right they had to violate her privacy in such a manner. Sir Malcolm's expression didn't change. He calmly explained that privacy was a privilege that came with responsibilities, and when she chose to flee the country with sensitive materials, she forfeited certain privacy protections. The review had been necessary to determine the extent of the security risk. He assured her that only a small number of trusted individuals had seen the contents, and they were all bound by strict confidentiality agreements. The materials would remain in secure storage and would not be destroyed. She had no doubt hoped they might be, but would be kept under palace control indefinitely. The conversation then shifted to the future. Sir Malcolm outlined a new framework of protocols that would govern her activities going forward. All travel plans, whether domestic or international, would need to be approved by the Royal Security Office at least 2 weeks in advance. Her financial transactions above a certain threshold would be monitored to ensure no unusual patterns emerged. Her communications, while not directly intercepted, would be subject to periodic review if security concerns arose. She would also be required to meet with a police-appointed advisor weekly to discuss her schedule, concerns, and any issues that might affect her well-being or security. Camilla felt the walls closing in around her. These new restrictions were suffocating. She was essentially being put on probation within her own household, treated like someone who couldn't be trusted. She asked Sir Malcolm if these measures were permanent or temporary. He replied that they would be reviewed after 6 months, but whether they continued would depend entirely on her cooperation and whether she rebuilt the trust she had broken. She wanted to argue that she had never signed up for this level of control, that she had a right to live her life with some degree of freedom and autonomy. But she knew it would be pointless. The palace held all the power, and she had given them every excuse to exercise that power by trying to flee. She had played directly into their hands, confirming their worst suspicions that she was unreliable and needed to be controlled more strictly. The meeting concluded with Sir Malcolm reminding her that discretion about these arrangements was essential. If any details of her escape attempt or the subsequent security measures became public, it would be assumed she was the source of the leak, and the consequences would be severe. He didn't specify what those consequences might be, but the implication was clear: her position within the royal family, already precarious, could be jeopardized entirely if she didn't cooperate fully. As Camilla was escorted back to her chambers, she felt utterly defeated. The life she had thought was a golden opportunity when she first became involved with Charles now felt like a trap from which there was no escape. She had tried once and failed spectacularly. Any future attempt would be even more difficult, given the increased surveillance and restrictions. She was truly trapped, not just physically, but emotionally and psychologically as well. Over the following weeks, she went through the motions of her royal duties with a sense of numbness. Public appearances were torture, knowing that behind her practiced smile was a woman who felt like a prisoner. She attended charity events, cut ribbons at ceremonies, and made polite conversation with dignitaries, all while feeling like she was performing in a play, where she hadn't chosen her role and couldn't leave the stage. The weekly meetings with her police-appointed advisor, a middle-aged woman named Dr. Patricia Wainwright, were particularly difficult. Dr. Wainwright was a psychologist by training but functioned more as a handler, carefully probing Camilla's state of mind while ostensibly offering support. Camilla knew that everything she said in these sessions was being reported back to the palace hierarchy. She had to be careful to appear stable and cooperative, while revealing nothing of her true feelings of desperation and resentment. During one session, Dr. Wainwright gently suggested that Camilla's escape attempt might have been a cry for help, rather than a genuine desire to leave. She implied that with proper support and adjustment of her royal duties, Camilla could find contentment in her position. Camilla nodded and agreed, saying what she knew the doctor wanted to hear, but inside she seethed at the condescension. Her escape attempt had been very real, born of very real suffering. To have it reframed as some kind of breakdown rather than a rational response to an intolerable situation felt like another violation. The most painful aspect of this new reality was the change in her relationship with Charles. He had become distant, as if he no longer knew how to relate to her. Their conversations were superficial, avoiding any real discussion of feelings or the state of their marriage. He threw himself into his work with even greater intensity than before, perhaps using it as an excuse to avoid dealing with the uncomfortable truths her escape attempt had revealed about their relationship and her unhappiness. Camilla began to understand that the palace's response to her escape attempt was not just about security or public relations. It was about control and punishment. They were making an example of her, showing her and anyone else who might consider defying royal expectations what would happen. The message was clear. Once you were part of the royal family, you belonged to the institution, not to yourself. Your life was not your own to direct. Your choices were not truly yours to make. And any attempt to reclaim your autonomy would be met with swift and thorough consequences. One evening, about 6 weeks after the incident, Camilla stood at the window of her chambers looking out at the London streets below. She watched ordinary people going about their lives, heading home after work, meeting friends for dinner, making plans for their futures. They had a freedom she had traded away, thinking she was gaining something more valuable. She had been wrong. The price of her position was higher than she had ever imagined, and she was paying it every single day. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Charles, making one of his increasingly rare visits. He looked tired, the weight of his responsibilities evident in the lines on his face. He sat down heavily and asked how she was coping. She gave him the answer she had learned to give, that she was adjusting. She understood why the security measures were necessary, that she was committed to her role. It was all lies, but they were the lies he needed to hear and the lies the palace needed him to believe. Charles seemed relieved by her words, as if he had been worried she might still be planning something reckless. He told her that the Queen had been asking about her, expressing concern about her state of mind. Camilla understood this was code. The Queen was monitoring the situation and would be watching for any signs that Camilla might still be a risk. She assured Charles that she was fine, that the incident was behind her, that it would never happen again. And as she said these words, she realized with a sinking feeling that they might actually be true. She might never have the courage or opportunity to try to escape again, which meant this life of controlled confinement might be her reality forever. 3 months after her failed escape attempt, Camilla found herself in a strange state of resignation. The heightened security around her had become routine. The weekly sessions with Dr. Wainwright had become predictable, and the restrictions on her freedom had become her new normal. She had learned to navigate this controlled existence, finding small pockets of autonomy within the rigid framework the palace had constructed around her life. But the fire that had driven her to attempt escape had not been extinguished, had merely been forced underground. Smoldering beneath a surface of compliance, the breaking point came unexpectedly during a formal state dinner. Camilla had been seated next to a visiting diplomat's wife, a woman who spoke enthusiastically about her recent travels through Southeast Asia. She described the freedom of exploring new cultures, the joy of making spontaneous decisions about where to go next, the simple pleasure of being anonymous in foreign cities. Every word felt like a knife twisting in Camilla's heart, reminding her of what she had lost and could never reclaim. During the conversation, the woman innocently asked Camilla where she most wanted to travel. The question hung in the air between them. Camilla opened her mouth to give the expected diplomatic answer about official duties and representing the crown. But something inside her broke. Instead, she excused herself abruptly and left the dinner table. Ignoring the startled looks and the breach of protocol her sudden departure represented, she needed air, space, anything to escape the suffocating reality her life had become. She found herself in one of the palace's smaller libraries, a room rarely used for official functions. She sat in the darkness, not bothering to turn on the lights, and let the tears she had been holding back for months finally fall. She had tried to be strong, to adapt, to accept her circumstances with grace and dignity. But in that moment she realized she was failing. The facade she had constructed was crumbling. She didn't know if she had the strength to rebuild it. She was still sitting there when Charles found her an hour later. He had left the state dinner as soon as he could politely do so, concerned about her sudden departure. He turned on a small lamp and sat down beside her, not speaking at first. When he finally asked what was wrong, Camilla found herself telling him the truths, all of it. She told him about the daily struggle to maintain her composure, the feeling of being watched constantly, the crushing weight of knowing that one mistake could result in even harsher restrictions. She told him that while she understood the palace's concerns, she was slowly dying inside under the weight of all the control and surveillance. Charles listened with an expression that gradually shifted from concern to something deeper, recognition perhaps, or understanding. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he began to speak, and what he said surprised her. He told her about his own struggles with the constraints of royal life, the times he had felt trapped by duty and expectation, the moments when he had questioned whether the price of his position was worth paying. He had never tried to escape physically as she had, but he had experienced his own forms of rebellion and had faced his own consequences. He admitted that he had not fully understood how difficult things had become for her until her escape attempt forced him to confront it. He had been so focused on managing his own challenges and preparing for his future role that he had failed to see how much she was suffering. Her dramatic action had been a wake-up call. But instead of responding with compassion and support, the institution had responded with control and punishment. He had allowed that to happen, even participated in it, because he had been frightened by the implications of her attempt to leave. Camilla looked at him in surprise. This level of vulnerability and honesty was rare from Charles, who usually maintained careful emotional control in all situations. She asked him what he was saying, what difference this understanding made now. The systems of control were already in place, the surveillance was ongoing, and she saw no way out of the trap she had found herself in. Charles took her hand and told her that he had been thinking about this situation constantly since it happened. He had come to realize that the palace's response, while understandable from an institutional perspective, was ultimately counterproductive. By treating her like a prisoner, they were guaranteeing that she would remain unhappy and potentially driving her to more desperate measures. He had decided to advocate for a different approach, one that acknowledged her needs while addressing the palace's security concerns. Over the next few weeks, Charles engaged in a series of difficult conversations with the Queen and senior palace officials. He argued that the current restrictions on Camilla were unsustainable and were damaging both her well-being and their relationship. He proposed to compromise, a gradual relaxation of the most restrictive measures in exchange for Camilla's full cooperation with reasonable security protocols and her commitment to the institution. It was not an easy sell. There was significant resistance from those who believed any leniency would be interpreted as weakness. The negotiations were complicated by the fact that trust, once broken, was difficult to rebuild. The palace officials who had reviewed Camilla's private letters and diary remained concerned about what they had read. Some of the correspondence revealed details about the early days of Charles and Camilla's relationship that could still cause scandal if made public. There were also indications in her diary of contacts with journalists in the past, raising questions about whether she might have leaked information to the press at various points. These discoveries made some officials reluctant to ease restrictions, fearing she might use any increased freedom to harm the institution. Charles had to provide assurances and guarantees that he knew he might not be able to keep. He essentially staked his own credibility on Camilla's future behavior, promising that if given the chance to live with more dignity and freedom, she would prove worthy of that trust. It was a significant risk for him to take, especially given the precarious nature of his own position as heir to the throne. Finally, after weeks of intense discussions and negotiations, a new arrangement was reached. The constant security presence around Camilla would be reduced to more normal levels for a senior royal. The weekly mandatory meetings with Dr. Winwright would become optional, but Camilla was encouraged to continue them if she found them helpful. The restrictions on her travel would be loosened, allowing her to make plans with only 1 week's notice rather than 2. And domestic travel would no longer require special approval. The monitoring of her financial transactions would continue, but would be less intrusive, focusing only on truly unusual activity rather than routine expenditures. In exchange, Camilla agreed to several conditions. She would participate in regular security briefings and would alert palace officials to any contacts from journalists or other potentially problematic individuals. She would maintain transparency about her travel plans and social engagements. Most significantly, she agreed that the sensitive materials confiscated during her escape attempt would remain, permanently in palace custody, and would never be returned to her personal possession. This was the price of her increased freedom, surrendering her most private possessions to institutional control. When Sir Malcolm Hartley informed her of the new arrangement, Camilla felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that the most oppressive restrictions would be lifted, but also sadness at what she had lost and could never reclaim. The locked box containing her letters, photographs, and diary would remain in a palace vault, a reminder that her past was no longer fully her own. The palace had claimed ownership not just of her present and future, but of her history as well. The changes took effect gradually over the following month. Camilla noticed the difference immediately: fewer guards, more privacy, less scrutiny of her daily activities. She could leave her chambers without feeling like a prisoner on supervised release. She could make phone calls without wondering who might be listening. She could plan outings without submitting detailed itineraries, days in advance. These small freedoms felt enormous after months of tight control. Her relationship with Charles also began to improve. The distance that had developed between them started to close as they worked to rebuild trust and understanding. They began talking more openly about their feelings, their fears, and their hopes for the future. Charles made more time in his schedule to be with her, and she made more effort to engage with the duties and responsibilities of her position. It was not a perfect reconciliation, but it was a genuine one. It's built on honest acknowledgement of what had gone wrong and commitment to doing better. Camilla also began to find new ways to assert her identity and autonomy within the constraints of royal life. She became more involved in charitable causes that genuinely mattered to her, using her position to make a difference rather than simply fulfilling obligations. She cultivated relationships with people outside the immediate royal circle who could offer perspective and support. She learned to navigate the system rather than fight against it, finding ways to achieve her goals within the acceptable parameters the palace had established. The incident with the royal guard and the seized luggage became a defining moment in Camilla's life, but not in the way she had initially feared. Rather than being the beginning of her permanent imprisonment, it became a turning point that eventually led to a more sustainable arrangement. She learned that dramatic gestures of rebellion, while born of genuine suffering, could backfire and make things worse. She discovered that lasting change in an institution as rigid as the monarchy required patience, negotiation, and strategic thinking rather than desperate action. Years later, when she occasionally thought back to that morning when Commander Blackwell stopped her car and seized her luggage, Camilla experienced a strange mix of emotions. Part of her still felt the humiliation and violation of that moment, but another part recognized it as the catalyst that forced necessary conversations and changes. If she had successfully escaped to France that morning, what would her life have become? Would she have found the freedom and peace she sought, or would she have discovered that running away solved nothing? These questions remained unanswered, existing in the realm of what might have been. What she knew for certain was that the life she ultimately built within the royal family, while still constrained and often challenging, was more authentic and sustainable than what she had experienced before her escape attempt. She had learned to advocate for herself more effectively, to communicate her needs more clearly, and to find meaning and purpose within the limitations of her position. The palace had learned that complete control was counterproductive, and that allowing senior royals some degree of autonomy and dignity actually served the institution's interests better than rigid restrictions. The locked box remained in the palace vault, and occasionally Camilla thought about the letters and diary it contained. Those items represented a version of herself that no longer fully existed, younger, more naive, less aware of the costs and compromises her position would require. In a way, it was fitting that they remained locked away, separate from her current life. They were artifacts of a different time, and while she wished she could have kept them private, their surrender had been part of the price she paid for the improved circumstances she now enjoyed. She never forgot the lesson of that morning. That escape from the royal family was not truly possible once you had committed to it, that the institution's reach was long, and its memory longer still, and that freedom within such a system had to be negotiated rather than seized. It was a hard lesson learned through humiliation and struggle, but it was one that ultimately helped her survive and even find moments of genuine happiness in a life that would always be defined by duty, obligation, and the weight of institutional expectations. Standing at the same window where she had once watched ordinary people with such envy, Camilla now looked out at the London streets with a different perspective. She would never have the simple freedom those people possessed, but she had found a way to make peace with that reality. Her life was complicated, constrained, and constantly scrutinized. But it was also meaningful in ways that continued to surprise her. The woman who had tried to flee in secret that early morning had been transformed by her failure into someone stronger, wiser, and more resilient. And in the end, perhaps that transformation was worth more than the escape she had sought.